Hi everyone, and welcome to Men's Movement channel. Uh, I'm David Pilbäck, and I'm the founder of the Men's Movement community. And today, I'm so happy to announce that our guest for today is the author Elizabeth Rosner, and we're going to talk with her about her new book, Survivor Café, and the concept of inherited trauma. So, welcome to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you.
Yes, I'm so happy to have you here. So, a little background. Your book is a blending of your personal story as a second-generation survivor, as both your parents are survivors of the Holocaust, and they met in Stockholm, and eventually they moved to Israel and then over to United States. Mm-hmm. I think I remember. And the book describes three journeys that you make with your father back to Buchenwald, the German concentration camp where he was imprisoned. And you blend these stories with the new discovered findings in epigenetics about how a trauma can impact our genes. And then these epigenetic modifications will transmit over to our offspring. So we have the second generation that will have impacted by the first generation's trauma. Mm-hmm. And then you blend that with the descriptions of other historical and modern genocides, like the one in Rwanda and the Armenian genocide. Mm-hmm. And you also talk about the nuclear bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yes. So it's a blend of these personal stories and the history and the science.
That's right.
Yes. And before we started this interview, you asked me, how did I stumble upon your book? And that's actually my introduction. It's a little bit embarrassing, but it's really fun. So I was working, and I'm fortunate that I can listen to books while I'm working some of my hours. And I had my little app with like audiobooks, and I was Googling for trauma because I'm really interested in trauma and the science of inherited trauma. And so your book came up, and then I read the back page, and it's like, she's a daughter of her father sat in the concentration camps, and it's a personal reflection and about the Holocaust and the Second World War and Jews. And I was like, what is this for me? I want to read a science report. I want to read something like that I can. I've seen Schindler's List, and I've seen war movies. So what can I possibly learn from this book? So I actually just put it down. And I put the phone back in my pocket, and I start working. And then I think it was like 3-4 minutes. And I said to myself, David, you're being an asshole here. Clearly it's something that you should learn here, and you're just avoiding it because I was so determined, I don't need this. And then I turn on the book and I listen, and the alphabet stuff that you do in the beginning. And it just sank in, and I cried, and I cried, and I cried. And I don't know how long this book is. Maybe it's like 10 hours. Something like that. And I think I cried like 100 times. It was it just touched me when I listened to it. So, of course, I had some rejection. I didn't want to listen to it. But then when I eventually got to it, it was a brilliant, beautiful experience for me. Yeah. So thank you for that.
Thank you for telling me that. I really appreciate your willingness to admit to the pushing away too, because I think that's important to acknowledge the resistance to the pain, or to even looking at it in a nuanced way. There's such a natural tendency for us to think that if we have a choice about pain, we would much rather choose not to feel it.
Yeah.
And I think so much of what I write about and have learned in my life is that A, we don't really have a choice, and B, pushing it away doesn't make it go away, right? Yeah. It pushes it down somewhere where it's going to keep on insisting on being felt until we finally allow it into awareness. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you say somewhere that one of your superpower is deep listening. So
I should make it clear that when someone asks you what is your superpower, it's not it's already a question that implies that everyone has a superpower, right? So it's not just that I have one, you have one, we all have something.
Okay, so how did you discover that there was deep listening?
Well, it's a good question, because one thing I can say about this book that I really actually put in the beginning of the book is this naming of the fact that, well, it feels like a fact that I've been aware of these stories and feeling this history all of my life. And I think that connects with this role that I was given to play in my family, which in many ways was the role of listening. So it's a little bit hard to tell whether I learned to listen or whether I showed up with a certain listening capacity and then that capacity just continued to develop. Yeah. There's no way to know, right? There's no way to know, but it feels in a way like I don't remember how that began. I just remember that I was always listening. And, we were talking before about my parents having Swedish as their secret language. So even my awareness that there was a secret language and that there was also a forbidden language, which was German. And then there was the language that they were speaking in America, which was their shared public language. And so even my recognition that I could tell the difference among those vocabularies when I could only understand the English, but I knew that there was something beautiful and moving about Swedish and somehow dangerous and worrisome about the German. And so all of that listening, in some ways, I feel was even my pre-verbal awareness. That even when I didn't know what the words were, I was feeling the content, or I was feeling the emotional texture and the weather in the house. The emotional weather.
Yeah. And I read somewhere lately that when they talk about first generation and second generation of survivors, that the first generation have a tendency to become rigid and to like hold everything in and don't talk and not sharing and just surviving, the surviving of it. And then the second generation, they feel everything that the first generation don't want to feel. So when the baby comes, they are soaked in all of this. So
and I think I'm always trying to be careful around too many generalizations. So even exemplified by my parents, who had very distinct experiences during the war. My father was in a concentration camp, but my mother was in a ghetto, and then she was in hiding. And they were very distinct individuals, not just because of gender and their experiences, but just biologically and socially different. And so, my mother was full of feeling. My father was more repressed, let's say, but he had a lot of visible emotion as well. It's just that I think each of them had strategies for managing their emotions. And as you say, I think my generation has a tendency to need to figure out different strategies for managing our emotions, and that the ones that our parents had to use or chose to use don't serve us in the same way, and that they had their reasons. I mean, survival in itself in some ways demands that you set aside a certain emotional layer of your life just to focus on what it takes to endure what you're enduring, and either to delay your emotional experience or just, shelve it indefinitely. Whereas my generation, you could say, we had the luxury of being able to feel all of our feelings whenever we were feeling them. But then the extra layer we had was this blurriness between our own feelings and the unexpressed feelings of our parents. So often people in my generation will say that we don't even know how we feel because we're so attuned and so deferential to the emotions of others, especially our parents, but even other people that we're close to, that we have this kind of, constantly permeable membrane around our emotional selves. And so some of us actually have to learn not just how to separate ourselves from the feelings of others, but then identify what it is. What do I really feel?
Yeah.
How do I
feel? Yeah. We talk about healthy masculinity here at Men's Movement. Is a big topic, and there is a Jew in Sweden who goes to schools and do the work that your father does, that talk about the Holocaust. And I had a telephone conversation with him where he said that so many of the guards in the concentration camps, they were still trying to get approval from their father. The father figure was not there, and he said that they had this this persona, this fake strength that was put on them, and he could still remember that, even though it was like 70 years ago. So have you heard something similar?
Well, I can't say that I have a direct echo of that, but what it makes me think about are some things that my father used to say about the German psyche, and not exactly that he would call it the German psyche, but the German family dynamic, let's say, where he would talk about the importance of the role of the father in a German family, and the way that the omnipotence of the father and the tendency for it to be a given that you don't question what the father's rules are, and that was how my father, who was himself, of course, born and raised in Germany, was trying to use to make sense of how could the German people have so willingly followed Hitler's genocidal program. And it was, in my father's view, that feeling of reverence and submission to the father figure that was his explanation, at least in part, for how such a, quote, civilized, nation could be so hypnotized into really mass murdering behavior that everyone essentially collaborated with one way or the other, except for some exceptions. And so that the way that it played out in my family actually is that my father also was really kind of a very strict, powerful father figure. And that was always a little bit ironic to me, because I felt like he could be critical of it in the one sense, as a kind of problematic structure and role that could lead to terrible things. And yet there was some way that he also didn't really question it for his own behavior. And now he's turning 90 soon, and he's so much softer and gentler than he used to be when I was growing up. And I feel like and also when he goes to schools, which he still does, as you mentioned, and he talks to young people, he's always encouraging them to question the authority figures, and not just submit and accept what they're being told. And he's saying that to the boys and the girls in these high school classes or whatever. So it's an interesting kind of paradox for me that he's a little split, I think, about it. And I don't know how that fits exactly with what you were saying, but this way of kind of taking on a role almost involuntarily, unconsciously, right? And so much of what it sounds like you're doing is encouraging people to become more conscious of the things that they're taking on unconsciously.
Yes.
And to question these so-called givens about what's the proper way to be if you're a man in the world, if you're a father, what's the proper expected set of behaviors and roles, and to ask questions about that, and to really consider, is this how I want to be? Does this feel healthy to me, for myself, for my children, for my family, for the community, for the country, for the world? What are we perpetuating if we don't question those?
Yes. So another thing that is really ironic is that my mother-in-law, she came from Estonia during the Second World War as a boat refugee when she was, I think she was 4 years old. And she lives now in Stockholm. And as you may know, of course, we have this new wave of nationalism over Europe, where in the elections they get from 10 to 20% of the votes. Nationalists that will close the borders and send people from other nationalities out of the country. And it's funny enough that my mother-in-law, she would be sent out, and the woman that I live with, she would be sent out because she's not Swedish, and our son would also be sent out because he's half not Swedish. And the really interesting thing is that those families emigrated from Sweden to Estonia like 400 years ago, and then they lived there for 400 years, and now they moved back. So it's really interesting, this and how do you relate to that? And you have the same in your country, in the Americas. So
yes.
How do you feel about that?
Oh, I have so many feelings about it. I'm deeply heartbroken at the I would say the mass regression that is happening in my country, even though you can also certainly make an argument that that what's really happening is that a lot of unresolved trauma is just more and more coming to the surface now. Yes. It was never really fully dealt with, and that whatever progress it seemed like we were making in terms of being more humanitarian and egalitarian, that in fact that was an incomplete direction we were moving in. And so not to get into a whole political analysis, but I think what hurts my heart really is this incredible denial, I think, and blindness to the ways in which we all Americans, and I'm a first generation American, right? But even Americans who can say I'm a fourth or a fifth generation American, we really all did come from somewhere else. And so this fantasy that white America needs to be restored somehow, and that immigrants are doing harm, it's a mass distortion. It's a profoundly disturbing distortion. And the irony to me also is that, so my parents met in Sweden because they were both refugees. My father from Germany, my mother from Poland, and for both of them, in some ways, Sweden was a temporary country, because my father thought he was eventually going to Israel, and my mother was eventually intending to come to America. And both of my parents were very linguistically adept, as I mentioned, and so their Swedish was very good and probably with barely a trace of an accent. But my father used to say that he was always perceived as German in Sweden.
Yeah.
And that he could feel this, especially because of this, how the Swedes felt about Germans. They didn't necessarily know he was a German Jew who had been in a concentration camp. But so he was aware that there was a way that he would never fully be accepted in Sweden as a foreigner. And when they came to America, so they got married in Israel, but they came to America. And my father said he realized right away that everybody was from somewhere else in America, and that he had as much opportunity to be a successful American as he wished, given the willingness to work hard and all of that. And that American dream felt real to them, my parents. And in many ways they fulfilled it for themselves and for their children. But this really somehow deeply held illusion that certain Americans hold about their own status and their own entitlement. Jews in some ways have it easier, I'll say, despite anti-Semitism, which of course again is also on the rise. We can blend in more easily than somebody with dark skin, or someone with different shaped eyes, or, that's just true. Yeah. So in many ways, I'm not up against the same kind of barriers as first generation Americans who have a different skin color. Yeah. And it's important for me to acknowledge that over and over again, that I still benefit from white privilege in this country, and that I can pass as a real American in that horrible way that people say.
Yes.
So it's part of a very big conversation. And one of the things you didn't mention in the introduction that I want to mention is that I also spend a lot of time in the book talking about the legacy of slavery in America.
Yes.
And the profound generational trauma that continues to resonate in this culture, not just among African Americans, but everyone in America who hasn't yet dealt with the way slavery created America. And that includes Jim Crow laws and racial injustice of all kinds. And so I think that even that as a category of atrocity and genocide that we keep on thinking we've addressed, but we really haven't fully addressed, is also being echoed in the way that we are responding to immigrants, so-called immigrants. And often I insist on using the word refugee rather than immigrant, because so many immigrants are refugees. And they're refugees from countries that are in crisis because of our foreign policies too, right? Yeah. So we are culpable in so many ways.
Yes. And the connection I want to make is between undealt trauma and masculinity norms, because I see it's a strong connection. I don't have any palpable that I can say, but that's the connection that I have in this conversation. And for instance, in Sweden, we have the Rasbiologiska Institutet, the Race Biological Institute in Uppsala, that the Germans were traveling to Sweden to learn about the race biology. So a lot of the ideology came from Sweden, and we haven't dealt with that. And this institute, we have laws to make sure that people with mental illness or mental disabilities shouldn't have children. So they have programs to make these people don't have children. So I am lucky to be alive because my mother was born, a couple of years after that was taking place. And we haven't dealt with that in Sweden. So that is a trauma we have. So I see, with this perspective that you have in the book, I just see that we will find it in more and more places. And that's, we bring everything up to the surface, and it's able to heal it.
Right. Yeah, I think it really is and has been for a long time a little too convenient to fixate on Germany and the Nazis as if they were an entirely self-created phenomenon and distinct from every other racist belief system or practice globally, that they came out of nowhere, and once they were defeated, that was at the end of it. And I think, Austria, for example, has found it very convenient to sort of keep pointing at Germany and saying, it wasn't us, it was them. And now Poland, of course, is trying to generate a bunch of laws saying that, it's a crime to refer to a Polish concentration camp. These were Nazi, the Poles didn't collaborate. The Polish government isn't responsible. And so I think, it's very difficult. It goes back to what we were saying at the beginning about the pushing away of pain, the shame that is associated with perpetration, and being even affiliated with perpetration historically is both a very individual problem and a collective problem. That shame really is one of the most toxic, I think, aspects of being human. And it's very difficult to address it alone. I think it really is so important that one of the things that you're doing, as I understand it, is, bringing men together in community and creating these efforts of support and exploration that are supportive and generative and regenerative, because an individual wrestling with shame is almost always going to want to turn away from it. Almost always going to want to, point the finger elsewhere rather than at oneself. And so I think this takes on, as I said, this national storyline too. And so I really applaud what you're doing, and I think it's so meaningful that you're being proactive about it and not reactive.
Thank you for that. Kind words. You quote a psychiatrist both in the book and then in the at the talk that you did on Google. You quote a psychiatrist who states that trauma sneaks into places it doesn't belong, especially for second generation of survivors. Can you address that a little bit?
Well, I think, often when people ask me what's my own pattern, what's my own, kind of evidence of having PTSD or traumatic residue, and I think that, the way I experience it, relevant to what you were just saying about, places it doesn't belong, is that, I'll just have these eruptions of anxiety or panic that have nothing to do with an actual experience, and that don't have to do with anything in the moment that's wrong. My most vulnerable time of day, for example, is when I'm trying to fall asleep at night, and I can have this cascading worrying, perseverating ideas running through my mind, but it can also feel really physical. I can feel as though I'm in danger, and I'm just lying in my bed in the dark. There's in a very peaceful and serene environment, I can be having this sort of internal rush of chaos and terror. And when I heard the psychiatrist say that that one of the definitions of PTSD is the inability to feel safe in a safe environment, that really spoke to me. That there's this disconnect. Yeah, exactly. I think it's really common, and the commonness doesn't actually deflect the truth of the statement. I think the fact that so many people recognize that is an indication that many, many more of us are suffering from inherited trauma than we've ever really known or named. And that the more we recognize what we have in common, the more we can help each other address it, because it's not it's not doom. We are not fated to suffer this forever.
Hmm.
Naming it is a big part of the healing process, as you know. But this recognition that I am feeling something that doesn't belong here, that it isn't even my own feeling, I don't think, or it seems to have a source in someone else's experience, and B, does it belong in this moment? That how do I, and some of these are really therapeutic practices, right? To bring the body back into the present state. Where are my feet? How am I breathing? What's my heart doing? How tapping, movement, all of these ways to sort of re-regulate our nervous systems, and remind ourselves that that this trauma is in some ways displaced and can be reconfigured. It really, one of the most hopeful comments I heard from another psychiatrist who specializes in trauma is, if trauma can change us biologically, that means we can also change our biology again, right?
Yes.
We can work on addressing these modifications so that they don't continue to be transmitted.
Yes.
That's really key, that we can interrupt the cycle, and we can really prevent this multi-generational continuity.
Yeah. Yes. And how do you think about trauma exposure? I mean, this is heavy subjects, and you've written a book, and from what I read, you have sat in many of those survivors cafes, and you discuss these horrendous things that have happened to people in so many ways. So how do you guard yourself from being like compassion fatigue or trauma exposure, so you don't get PTSD from just listening to all of this?
Right. Well, the interesting thing to me is how consistently the very people who are sharing some of the most difficult and traumatic memories with me are also demonstrating to me their resiliency.
Yeah.
And their strategies or just temperamental capacities for hope and to have real choices that they continue to exercise about where they put their attention in a daily way. And my father is a perfect example. I mean, I've been listening to my father's stories all of my life, and I've also been a witness to my father's phenomenal, heroic optimism. He's truly one of the most hopeful people I've ever met. And so to see that, and it's impossible to know, is that just how he's wired, from the day he was born? Or is that something that he really continued to nurture in himself so that his experiences wouldn't destroy his way of living in the world, and other survivors that I've met of terrible atrocities who, I'm crying when they're talking to me, but they're not crying because they're saying to me, I'm here, I'm okay, and so that sort of splashes back onto me and into me, that quality of recognizing that we aren't only defined by the terrible things that happen to us, and that these people are demonstrations of that, and very important role models for me, because I'm not as optimistic as my father, and so I have to keep actively taking that in, and then I also have to know when I've exhausted my capacity for empathy, or when I really do feel that that I'm somehow ingesting too much, and that it's doing harm to me. And so even though I wrote this book more rapidly than I've written any of my other books, I was still really knowing that there were times I had to step all the way back and go for a long walk in the woods and really make a point of remembering how much beauty there is in the world.
Yeah.
And you know that the world can start to feel very, very ugly and dark when you study humans at their worst. And so I knew I also had to keep remembering that there's the opposite of that. You know, humans at their best also
Yeah.
exist.
Yes. That's so funny because that's my ending, the beauty in the world. I will come to that. I will come back to that. Uh, as far as I know, your book is groundbreaking because it makes a bridge between art and the science of epigenetics. So what do you think will come? I mean, I think there will be more artworks that have this new perspective because it changes how we understand ourselves as a human being and the collective. So what do you see, what will come next after this? Not personally by you, but with others.
Yeah. That's a wonderful, it's a wonderful curiosity that I share with you. How will we do even more of this bridging? I mean, I'm humbly honored to hear you refer to my book as groundbreaking. I know that I'm not alone in seeking to connect the dots across disciplines, and I've been inspired by others who have done it before me, and that I do feel that in the same way I want to believe that globally we are, at the same time this horrible, you know, white supremacist stuff is going on, I also really do see an increased blending of cultures and a willingness for people to hybridize their own identity, you know, across gender lines, across color lines, across faiths, across nationalities. And so for me, this creative form of that, of saying, you know, why do we differentiate between the arts and the sciences really? You know, why do we believe that there really is such a thing as a hard right brain, hard left brain separation? That I think that, you know, the more you're willing to look at nuance, the more you recognize that those are really false dichotomies. For some reason, humans seem to crave certainty and to crave, you know, boundaries and distinctions and discernment. But at the same time, I think we can be so comforted by, I don't know, when the lines aren't as well defined. And so I think that this way that we recognize that our hearts, our minds, our bodies, our spirits are all ways that we engage with each other and the world, and that just using our intellect doesn't serve us well. And just feeling with our hearts is also limiting because, as you said, you know, you really at first were rejecting my book because you wanted the hard science, you know, and that when you understood that, oh, you could learn in both ways simultaneously, that you could have, you know, so-called hard science integrated with an emotional, personal, intimate story, and that those would serve each other. You know, it's not a choice you have to make between them. I think I would like to believe that is a developing understanding of how to be in the world more fully. Whether you're an artist or whether you're a scientist, the idea that you can be both and that they benefit each other.
I want to end our discussion with something that you touched on before, that the beauty and the horror can coexist, and they exist side by side. And your book is full with these contradictions with the big banquet of food in the middle of the concentration camp on your second trip. And there's feast with just so much food where people were starved to death. It's such a contradiction.
It's a contradiction that that exists all around us all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, that banquet is the world, right?
Yeah.
There are people starving and people feasting side by side in every corner of the world.
Yeah.
I've witnessed it. I'm sure you've witnessed it also. Where I live is one of the wealthiest places in America, which is one of the wealthiest countries in the world.
Mm.
And there are people living under the freeway in absolute destitution.
Yes.
So I bear witness all the time to that contradiction. I think it was particularly surreal to me in that place because for me, that place is the embodiment of the most extreme presence of evil.
Mm.
But it also is really important for me to acknowledge that, again, just to repeat that theme of, you know, not to only imagine that this happened during the war in Germany under the Nazis, you know, that as acutely nightmarish as that was, and I in no way mean to diminish the absolute horror of all of that, and maybe now's as good a time as any to say that in my book I really do make a point of saying that I am not interested in comparing the Holocaust to other genocides or atrocities. I'm not interested in arranging them hierarchically, which is worse, which is less worse, all of that. So when I talk about the Holocaust, you know, as a unique event and as a unique horror, I can still say that yes, the emblems of the Holocaust, the willingness to look the other way, the willingness to perpetrate atrocities and dehumanize others, that is still in us as human beings. So it's not limited to the Holocaust, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But that this beauty alongside horror really is one of the paradoxes of humanity and maybe the natural world too. I mean, there are violent species other than humans, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think we're the worst. I think we're really the worst. But the image, I don't know if this was one of the images you were referring to also, is the Japanese art of kintsugi, which I write about in the book. It's also very meaningful to me because it represents the literal healing of broken pottery, using gold to fill in the cracks so that the cracks remain not just visible, but actually highlighted in the repaired piece. And that for me is such a beautiful image of what it means to acknowledge where we've been wounded, where we've been damaged, whether it's our own damage or something we inherited. And that by looking at it with love and deep consideration and empathy, that we're not trying to make it disappear and pretend it was never there. We're not trying to repair ourselves to the point that we look perfect, but that we ourselves are able to be repaired, but in this way that still shows our scars and still shows the places where we're vulnerable and capable of suffering.
Yeah.
And that there is beauty in that. There is actual beauty in the damage, you know, that we can humanize that. We can embrace that. And that to me is a way of saying that beauty and sorrow can coexist without erasing one another.
Yes. Yes, a brilliant ending to our talk. Thank you so much for your time, for sharing your ideas. Really, I think that this gives me hope that you have written this book and talked to all these people, and you're still so hopeful and so positive about it, and the human potential that people can go through really hard times, but grow and grow resiliency.
Well, thank you so much. I really want to say how important it is to me to speak with you and to know that you're choosing to do work yourself that is transformative toward the future. And So you represent hope for me as well. You really do.
Yeah. Yeah, we have to take responsibility. And if our viewers want to find your books, I'm sure they can find it on Amazon and all the big bookstores. I learned in the book that's the leaf of the ginkgo.
That's right.
Yeah, the living fossil.
Yeah, the ginkgo tree is a really wonderful symbol of resiliency as well, and you can read about that in the book. But yeah, please do let people know that they can find me online. I have a website, elizabethrosner.com. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Instagram. I really welcome hearing from people who have read the book or who feel that the book has impacted them in some way, and it's a wonderful thing for an author to know that her words are being received by people all over the world, and that when my book enters someone like it's entering you, and then you give it back, it's a great gift to me. So I thank you for that.
Yeah, I'm happy for that. So thank you for our talk. Okay, goodbye.
Hej då.
Hej då. Hej då.